Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History. Today, we're going to begin kind of talking about the opening of the West and really this westward expansion that we see in the time period after the Civil War and certainly during and after Reconstruction. And so the image that we're looking at here to kind of kick off the unit highlights the importance of the railroads. And in particular, we're looking at Promontory Point in Utah, which is where the Transcontinental Railroad, which we'll discuss today, was finally connected. Union and Central Pacific Railroads finally met in what was Utah Territory at the time. So looking at our learning objective for today, we're going to be able to explain how, with the beginning of miners and boom towns, how we find that miners finding gold in the West, and particularly beginning in Colorado, and then also certainly silver in Nevada and gold as well in the Black Hills of South Dakota, is going to lead to the creation of new states, starting with Colorado and certainly expanding throughout the West. And so we're going to see how that all also gets fueled, of course, with the railroads. So before we talked about the Civil War, we highlighted, the 49ers who made their way in 1849 to California for the gold rush. That ends up ending in about the mid-1850s. And so the next kind of wave of mining gets certainly broadcasted by newspapers, claiming that prospectors were certainly making large sums of money by mining, and this time it was in the Colorado Rockies. But certainly one of the big differences between the mining that would have to take place as well as the mining that would have to take place in places like Colorado versus California is the density of the rock in which you're going to have to dig into. So most of the gold that you would find in, say, Colorado or in the Rockies is very much buried deep within rock layers. And so it was going to require you to extract those particles. Extract's one of our vocab words this unit. That means removing. And so it's going to take a little bit more dynamite. It's going to take a little bit more of other resources to really mine out this gold and silver that you find out west. This is probably one of the world's richest deposits of silver-bearing ore as well. And probably the most famous of these mines is one in Nevada, however you want to pronounce it, that's called the Comstock Lode. And this was discovered in Nevada in 1859. And again, it's going to be one of the richest sources of silver in the entire world. Just to kind of give you guys a visual of what it looked like, you've got these series of elevators that miners would go through and open ports, and then you would add to them certainly as you widened out the mine. But certainly in Nevada, this would have provided quite a living for people, again, making their way into the earth and mining for those riches. So again, where was the Comstock Lode? We can see that we know it was silver, and that's going to help us narrow it down. This is near Virginia City and Carson City, which of course is our capital in what eventually will become the state of Nevada. Another site is the gold site in South Dakota, which we'll find in the Black Hills. Certainly also we should note that along with the Black Hills and much of this territory that you're going to see in this time period is occupied by Native Americans and Native peoples. And so certainly you're going to see throughout this unit that this idea of taking land is going to lead to tension between Native Americans and the ever-expanding United States. So with the finding of all this gold, people are going to want to move out west, much like we saw in California. It's going to be very similar. You're going to see the creation of these boom towns. And reminder, boom towns, from when we talked about them earlier, same kind of thing, but they're these towns that grow very, very rapidly. They're usually inhabited by people who are quite lively. They tend to have very little guaranteed laws, and they tend to include people who can be violent at times. They're also home to vigilantes, which are people who take the law into their own hands. And so there's really no, say, police force or military presence. And so people would take the law into their own hands in order to, my apologies, for doling out justice. A lot of your western mine areas, again, increased in population by 1890. Again, you've got 7 new states, and again, the first one was Colorado. So, quick question then is, which western territory was the first to join the United States in the late 1880s? Is it Washington, Colorado, Idaho, or Wyoming? Pause if you need to think about it, rewind. But the best answer here is Colorado. All right, we talked about them at the beginning, but let's bring back the railroads. Now, they are going to be responsible for transporting that gold and silver to the markets because that's how miners make their money. But you're also going to see that they bring supplies to the miners as well, things to help build up their towns, things to do the mining itself. And so you're going to see the railroad's going to play a really important role in the expansion of the United States. So the need for these railroads really begins to be seen after 1865, so the end of the Civil War, and really continues through Reconstruction and even after Reconstruction into the 1890s. And so the government recognizes the importance of this, and they're going to put together some subsidies and land grants in order to support that expansion. Now, subsidies, this is when money is given typically by the government to a person or sometimes a company for actions that are intended to benefit the public. Today, we'll see that sometimes with, other forms of public transportation. Sometimes they include trains, sometimes they include busing, sometimes they're airports. Other times you'll also see it with forms of entertainment, like sports teams, for example, sometimes receive state subsidies in order to help build, say, arenas or stadiums. And so they're still common today. But again, they're when you're using that public money in order to either help a company or a person in building something that will benefit the public or benefit a large group of people. So there's going to be a need for a lot of land. And again, that land is going to have to come from Native Americans. You're going to see some of it taken through war. You're going to see some of it taken through treaties with several broken promises to Native people. You're going to see some of it just taken by force and assumed or claimed by the U.S. government. And so you're not going to see compensation that is right or justified through a lot of these transactions. So between the land grants that were offered to the railroads, they're particularly going to 2 companies that are going to create and build what's going to be called a Transcontinental Railroad system, which is going to eventually be completed in around May 10th, 1869. So let's break down that word transcontinental because it's one of our vocab words. Trans means through. And so as a prefix, that'll kind of help you with some other words. But continental, of course, refers to a continent. So we're talking about the extension across or through a continent. And then this is ultimately going to connect basically the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean for the first time in the history of the United States. And so that railroad system, again, gets completed May 10th of 1869. Now, the 2 companies that are receiving these subsidies from the U.S. government are the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. These are the 2 major railroads that are eventually going to meet in Utah. And let's break down a little bit of kind of the differences between these 2. So the Union Pacific is going to lay track from basically Omaha, Nebraska, until they get to Promontory Point in Utah. Whereas the Central Pacific is going to lay from California, basically Sacramento, east to Promontory Point, Utah. Now, the Union Pacific mostly hires Irish immigrants, former African American slaves, and in some cases, newly enfranchised or, new to 14th, 15th, 13th Amendments. And you're also going to see a fair amount of ex-Confederate soldiers who are kind of trying to hit the reset button. A lot of those workers are going to go and work for the Union Pacific. What you're going to see more with the Central Pacific is you'll still see immigrants, but you're predominantly going to see Chinese workers. And one of the big differences between these two is the geography. Central Pacific has to contend a little bit more with the Sierra Nevada mountains, while both of them have to deal with mountains because the Rockies are going to be just a fact of life in this. But you're going to see that Chinese workers are going to be handling a lot more dynamite to help them get through. Both are going to work in very harsh conditions, hot temperatures, use dangerous materials, but certainly you're going to see several Chinese workers die in explosions. But as far as who laid more mileage, that would be the Union Pacific. Now, again, with the Great Plains, it would have been much easier to lay track more quickly. And one of the things you'll see is they tend to curve the track. It doesn't tend to be a straight shot because the more miles of railroad they laid, the more money they'd get. And so both of these kind of suffer from a little bit of corruption. But again, you're going to see a lot of Irish and African-American workers, Chinese workers, but you're going to see people looking for new economic opportunity. So the tracks finally meet again, Promontory Point Summit in what is Utah Territory at the time, where you've got the current governor of California at the time, Leland Stanford. You may know Stanford University. He drove in the last golden spike. And that officially really connected the United States for the first time in its history. And so traveling across the country is going to be so much quicker than it used to be. And so you're going to see people moving much more rapidly. Now, what are going to be the effects of this? So you're going to see with this, because markets now are more connected, you're going to see more demand for things like steel, coal, and construction supplies, because now you're going to see the building of big cities, and you're going to see cities popping up throughout the country. And so in order to build more bridges, to build and sustain, the railroads, and to build up, these, eventually we're going to see skyscrapers, you need the supplies in order to do that. You're going to see new towns pop up along train stations and people trying to find, a new place to live, perhaps, and a new opportunity out west. Ranchers are going to start moving out west. You're going to see a lot of Scandinavian and German and even later Irish make their way into out west for agricultural opportunity. You're also going to see that the trains need to have a schedule, one, to prevent accidents from trains colliding, but also to understand when trains should arrive and when trains should leave. And so you're going to see that our country is going to get divided into 4 time zones in order to help essentially make things safer and more reliable. And so the American Railroad Association creates those 4 time zones, which we would now call Pacific, Central, Mountain, and Eastern time zone. So certainly the Pacific, would be along the West Coast. You got your Mountain time, which would be like Colorado and Wyoming. Then you've got Central, which would be like your Midwest, like Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and then out east, like New York, Pennsylvania, Maine. Those would be your Eastern time zones. And then, of course, you're just going to see more efficient travel. And you're also going to see that people are going to have more markets connected to them. And, through ordering catalogs, people in the Midwest are now going to have access to things that people out east used to only have access to. And so you're really going to see a more united America for the first time since the Civil War, and certainly one that is more connected. So for my students, that's going to wrap up section 1. By all means, make sure that you're following along with the guided notes. If you've got any questions, please ask. For those of you who are listening, I just appreciate it. I hope that, again, we can help you understand kind of this expanding westward direction and growth in U.S. history after the Civil War and certainly after Reconstruction. So, thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day.